Richard III, the last king from the House of York, reigned over England from 1483 until his death in 1485. His reign, though brief, has been the subject of intense debate and scrutiny over the centuries. Richard's legacy is often defined by his dramatic rise to power, his role in the Wars of the Roses, the contentious circumstances of his accession to the throne, and his controversial death at the Battle of Bosworth Field, which ended the Plantagenet dynasty and paved the way for the establishment of the Tudor dynasty. Richard's reign was marred by political intrigue, accusations of tyranny, and the mysterious disappearance of his young nephews, the princes in the Tower. His reputation has been shaped by both historical events and the works of later writers, most notably Shakespeare, whose portrayal of Richard as a villain has had a lasting impact on his legacy. However, recent historical scholarship has begun to reassess his reign, offering a more nuanced view of his character and rule. Richard III was born on October 2nd, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle, the youngest son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. His birth came during a period of intense dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York, a struggle known as the Wars of the Roses. His father, Richard of York, claimed the throne of England, which was occupied by the Lancastrian King Henry VI. The wars, fought intermittently between 1455 and 1487, were a bitter conflict over the control of the English throne, with both the Lancastrians and Yorkists seeking to assert their right to rule. As the youngest son of the Duke of York, Richard was not initially expected to ascend to the throne. However, the tumultuous nature of the Wars of the Roses and the early deaths of his older brothers meant that Richard's position within the Yorkist family became increasingly significant. Richard's early life was shaped by the conflicts surrounding him. His father's death in 1460, followed by the death of his elder brother, Edward, in 1471, left Richard as the next heir to the Yorkist cause after his older brother, Edward IV, became king in 1461. During his early years, Richard was given substantial responsibility within the Yorkist court. He was made Duke of Gloucester in 1461, and over the next decade, he was a loyal supporter of his brother, Edward IV. Richard fought alongside Edward in numerous battles, including the decisive victory at the Battle of Towton in 1461, which secured Edward IV's reign. Richard also played a role in securing Yorkist control over the north of England, particularly after the defeat of the Lancastrian forces. Despite his loyalty to his brother, Richard's path to the throne was complicated by the political dynamics of Edward IV's reign. Richard was notably affected by the deaths of his brother George, Duke of Clarence, and his nephew Edward IV. These events would come to define Richard's legacy as a ruler and ultimately lead to his ascension to the throne. Richard's rise to the throne was marked by controversy and political maneuvering. In 1483, after the sudden death of his brother, King Edward IV, Richard was appointed Lord Protector for his young nephew, Edward V, who had succeeded his father as king. Edward V, however, was only 12 years old, and as such Richard was expected to govern on his behalf. The political situation in England at the time was tense. Richard's position as Lord Protector was complicated by the influence of his sister-in-law, Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of Edward V, and the powerful Woodville family. Elizabeth Woodville's strong influence at court, coupled with her desire to secure her own family's position, caused significant friction between her faction and Richard's. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, sought to consolidate his power and ensure his own survival in a court filled with intrigue. According to Richard's supporters, Elizabeth Woodville and her family conspired to limit Richard's authority and to marginalize him politically. The political conflict between Richard and the Woodvilles came to a head in 1483, when Richard took action to eliminate his rivals. Richard's move to secure the throne involved a controversial and dramatic step. He declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, thus invalidating the legitimacy of Edward V and his siblings. Richard claimed that Edward IV had been pre-contracted to another woman before marrying Elizabeth, and as such their marriage had been illegal. By this reasoning, Richard declared that he was the rightful king, and he seized the throne from his nephew, Edward IV. Richard's controversial actions were presented as a legal and moral justification for his claim to the throne. Richard's supporters argued that his actions were necessary to restore order and stability to the kingdom. However, his usurpation of the throne alienated many, especially supporters of the Woodville family, and his legitimacy was questioned by a significant portion of the nobility. Richard's reign, which lasted from 1483 to 1485, was marked by a series of political challenges and military confrontations. Despite Richard's attempts to present himself as a capable and just king, his rule was dogged by suspicions of illegitimacy, accusations of tyranny, and internal instability. One of Richard's early efforts was to secure the loyalty of key nobles and ensure political stability in the realm. He made significant efforts to reconcile with the Yorkist factions and strengthen his position. But his reign was immediately marked by significant unrest. The most notable challenge to his authority came from Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant to the throne. Henry Tudor, who would later become Henry VII, gathered an army in exile and invaded England in 1485, seeking to challenge Richard's rule. Henry's claim to the throne was based on his maternal descent from John of Gaunt, the third son of Edward III. The rising support for Henry Tudor's cause, particularly from disillusioned Yorkists and Lancastrians, threatened Richard's position. Richard, facing the prospect of a Lancastrian challenge to his throne, met Henry Tudor's forces at the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485. The battle was decisive. Richard's forces were defeated, and Richard was killed in battle, marking the end of the Wars of the Roses and the last stand of the Yorkist dynasty. His death brought Henry Tudor to the throne as Henry VII, beginning the Tudor dynasty. One of the most enduring aspects of Richard III's reign is the mystery of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, who disappeared while in Richard's custody in the Tower of London. Edward V and Richard were placed in the Tower following Richard's assumption of the throne, but they were never seen again after the summer of 1483. The disappearance of the two young princes has been the subject of much speculation and debate. Richard III's supporters claim that the princes were simply removed from court to protect them from potential harm during a period of political instability. However, many historians and contemporaries have suggested that Richard was responsible for their deaths, fearing that their presence would challenge his legitimacy as king. The mystery surrounding the princes' disappearance and their presumed murder has had a lasting impact on Richard III's reputation. Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard as a villain who murdered his nephews to secure the throne has shaped much of the popular perception of Richard. However, the evidence surrounding the prince's fate remains inconclusive, and modern historians have explored alternative theories, including the possibility that the princes were victims of other political factions or that they died of natural causes. Richard III's reign and his legacy remain a subject of intense debate. For centuries, he was vilified as a tyrant, largely due to Shakespeare's portrayal of him as a deformed, power-hungry villain who murdered his nephews and seized the throne through treachery. This view of Richard persisted through much of English history, contributing to his reputation as one of the most notorious English monarchs. However, modern scholarship has sought to reassess Richard's legacy in a more nuanced light. While it is clear that Richard's usurpation of the throne and the disappearance of the princes were highly controversial, some historians argue that Richard was a capable and reform-minded ruler. Richard was known for his legal reforms, particularly the establishment of the Court of Requests to handle grievances from the common people, and for his efforts to strengthen royal authority. His reign was also marked by attempts to balance the interests of the nobility and ensure peace in the kingdom. The rediscovery of Richard's remains in 2012 under a car park in Leicester has also played a role in reshaping his legacy. The discovery of his body, along with the evidence of his physical condition — he suffered from scoliosis — has provided a new perspective on his personal character, dispelling some of the myths that had developed around him. Richard's remains were reburied in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, bringing an end to a centuries-old debate over his final resting place.